You can make arguments and counterarguments on these kinds of points. So let's look at counterarguments. So I'm going to shift gears and we're going to talk about marijuana legalization again. So here in this section of the book, it's section 3 of this chapter, counterarguments and rebuttals. So I'm going to take some common arguments for keeping marijuana illegal and show some counter arguments against that, and careful counter arguments that consider some of the points that opponents of keeping marijuana illegal might have. So I'll present some kind of typical arguments that one writer might present, saying we should keep it illegal here in the US, and potential counter arguments to that. So one, marijuana is an addictive drug, and 35 million people in the US have become addicted to this drug. Well, one thing you can do as a counter-argument is to say, hey, those facts are wrong. Those facts are made up, or they don't have any scientific support. There's no evidence. This claim is false. So a person responding to this could say, this is false. There's a lot of research now. It shows that it's not addictive. It's not any more addictive than alcohol. Those statistics that you cited are just wrong. That's just the number of regular users, people who use it regularly or from time to time. It doesn't mean that they're addicted. You're kind of twisting the facts. So a counter argument would point out, hey, you're misusing the facts, you're misstating the facts. Those are not true. Regular use is not the same as addiction. And while there are some people with some problems with the drug, it's not maybe addiction. 2, marijuana is a gateway drug. That means, if you use marijuana, it's going to lead to harder drugs, cocaine and heroin. Response, this is false. There's no evidence that it's addictive, that it's a gateway drug to other drugs. If people do later go onto other drugs, it's for reasons not related to marijuana, and the person can cite research evidence to back this claim up. Because drug addiction really involves a number of social and personality factors that go beyond this and different from marijuana use. Harmful effects of marijuana mean it should be illegal is a possible claim one might make to say, let's keep it illegal. And a person replying to this could say, it has some negative health effects, but no more necessarily than alcohol or other legal drugs. And it also has positive effects. There's a lot of research showing it has some positive health effects for certain medical conditions, for a number of medical conditions, which outweigh the negative effects. Again, we're talking about adults anyway. Therefore, that argument doesn't hold true. Another argument one might present against marijuana is the negative effects of marijuana for children and teenagers. Therefore, this will lead, if you legalize it, we're going to have a lot of teenagers growing up addicted to marijuana, and will not have, meaningful jobs and contribute to society. And this could be a misstatement of what legalization advocates really advocate. I don't think legalization advocates, those who want to legalize marijuana, would ever say, it should be okay for teenagers to use. Because we know from research, it's bad for teenagers. Teenagers shouldn't use marijuana. Adults, it can be beneficial, especially for medical conditions. But we know about the negative effects of marijuana for children or teenagers. And so it's like, we're not advocating that, man. That's not what we're for. We're for legalizing it for adults. So the argument against marijuana could be kind of a straw man argument. That is, it's kind of a misstatement of what the other side believes, a straw man. So a straw man is kind of like a fake person. So rather than arguing against what someone really believes, you misstate or overgeneralize what they claim, what they believe in, and attack that. And politicians do this all the time. They misrepresent what their opponents believe and attack that, and attack a misrepresentation of their opponents. So obviously, we are not for legalizing marijuana for young people. And again, with teen addiction, it's not the availability of the drug, it's other social and psychological factors that need to be addressed there, not the availability of the drug. You could take other kinds of social issues and play this kind of argument, counter-argument back and forth as an exercise. One thing I like to do in this class when we have live classes is EMI, English Medium Instruction, Yonggang Kangi, Yonggang policy at some Korean universities, like one where I worked at before in Seoul. And this means new professors who are hired in most any department, whether it's biology or chemistry or engineering or history or whatever, have to teach some classes in English, and students have to take a certain number of courses in English to graduate. That means courses in their major, whether their major is biology, engineering, history, psychology, whatever. And I've become skeptical of this as a policy, at least the way it's been done at many Korean universities. So people for EMI might say, a mandatory EMI policy might say, well, it's going to lead to better English skills among students. It's going to improve their English skills. I could say, no, there's no evidence for that. You don't have any evidence for that. What evidence do you have? Because what little research is available on this shows that students might improve their English vocabulary in that field, and that's it. There is no evidence that they improve in their overall English skills. You don't have any evidence for that. And advocates of a strict EMI policy might say, well, it works, especially if you hire English-speaking professors, either foreigners or Koreans who studied in graduate school in, say, the US and Canada and UK. And you could argue, well, first of all, hiring foreign professors specifically for this is hard. It's hard for departments to provide extra support for foreigners, especially if you're hiring foreigners specifically to teach courses in English at a university in Korea. That's really problematic. And two, look at professors who are Koreans who studied in the US. They spent all of their time studying, working, not necessarily immersing themselves in the language and culture while they were in the US or Canada. So just because they studied in the US or North America doesn't mean that they can actually teach very effectively when you put them in a classroom in Korea with Korean students and say you're supposed to teach in English. There are all kinds of principled arguments against this policy, and a lack of real evidence that the EMI policies, there's a lack of evidence that this works, at least the way that many universities have done it in Korea. And you could do the same thing with some other controversial issues like those listed in my books. So, in terms of presenting counterarguments, maybe your paper is presenting a counterargument to some belief that some people accept, or you're responding to someone's counterarguments to you with your rebuttals, your counterarguments, your rebuttal, your response to that. Some things that you might do, as we see in some of these examples I just discussed. Number one, the facts you just presented are just wrong, or the arguments you presented are just wrong. Either the facts that you cited are wrong or incorrect, or you have misstated them, or the evidence you provided is wrong, or it's really too weak. And you counter by presenting evidence from good, reliable sources that support your claims, to say, the evidence, the data support this view, not that view. So the argument is not supported by evidence, or the evidence and facts that you have cited are just wrong, and pointing out the problems with the evidence or support that the other side has made. Another kind of argument might be, well, the consequences of this are unacceptable. They're bad. Look at, laws against marijuana and drugs in the US. What have been the consequences? A lot of black people being sent to jail. A lot more than white people. Is that acceptable? No. The war on drugs in America has been very harmful, very unfair to Hispanics and blacks and other minorities, poor people. Most white people, when they're arrested for drugs, having drugs or using drugs, many times they don't go to jail. These consequences are not morally acceptable or ethically acceptable. They're even kind of offensive. Get to your sense of ethos or ethics and morals or pathos, your sense of moral sensibilities. But be careful not to exaggerate these kinds of arguments or overstate them. But the consequences of this are worse than that. Another one is the argument is correct but not significant, not really relevant, so kind of conceding. That's true, but yeah, marijuana is bad for kids, but that's not what we're advocating. We know it's bad for kids. That's not what we're advocating. We're just talking about making it legal for adults. And we know it's not good for kids, for teenagers. 5, pointing out that the argument is just illogical. It doesn't follow from the premises. There are logical problems. You've overgeneralized. You misstated our position. You've made a straw man argument against us. That's not what we believe. That's not what we advocate. Sometimes you might go so far as to say, true but not relevant. True but not relevant here. Argue against their logic, maybe argue against some of their assumptions. You're assuming that marijuana use is just inherently immoral and dangerous, and it's not. For a lot of people, it's medicine. For some people, it's just like, drinking alcohol, and it's not necessarily immoral. I mean, what basis do you have for making moral claims about using marijuana? Or assumptions that people get into drugs because there's something morally wrong with them, when you need to consider, well, there are important social factors and psychological factors involved in addiction, which psychologists have known about for a long time, or medical professionals have known for a long time. So your assumptions about drug use are just wrong. And finally, counterexamples, providing counterexamples to their claims. You claim this, but look at these examples. Look at these cases. Look at these cases where EMI has not worked. Students struggling to understand lectures. 80% of students at this university said they can't really fully understand the lectures in English. So that's not working. Counterexamples. Some cautions: be careful to either overgeneralize your claims or overgeneralize what the opponent is saying. Don't strawman the opponent. Don't overgeneralize or oversummarize differing views or opposing views. Don't make overly strong arguments or counter-arguments that don't have enough support for the way that you have stated them. Be willing to use concessive formulations sometimes. That's true, however. The fact is, or that may be true, but that's not quite relevant, or that may be true, but that's not exactly what we're advocating. That's not exactly the cause of the problem here. Sometimes you can refer to the opponent's ideas and background them using subordinate clauses, like although opponents of marijuana believe this, comma, the truth is, like although, but, however. Use those kinds of expressions to kind of background what the other side says. Although they believe that, the reality is, or the facts show this. And of course, avoid logical fallacies, which we'll talk about. So if you're like part of your essay, your whole essay is maybe arguing against a certain viewpoint or arguing against a commonly held belief. There are different ways of doing this. You can kind of present the opposing viewpoint, describe it in the introductory paragraph, and then your thesis says, however, I'm going to argue the other way. And I have some examples in the book. You can do it within a body paragraph. So for example, here's an example in the book: a mixed market economy, Although certain kinds of conservatives believe that open markets, unregulated markets act as sort of rational entities that police themselves, the truth is, the reality is this. Or conservatives mistakenly view markets as rational organic entities. The reality is much more complicated. Thus, we are going to argue for this view of, say, economic regulation. You can have separate paragraphs, one paragraph that, a brief paragraph or part of a paragraph that briefly summarizes the opposing viewpoint, and then you come along and say, however, and you present your arguments against it. There are a few arguments in the book. So, for example, in this section of the book, getting back to the EMI example, define the scope of your argument for your paper. Are you talking about EMI at an entire university, in your particular department or field, at all Korean colleges and universities with this policies? Are you talking about EMI in general, or mainly the more problematic cases where EMI is mandatory? The university says it's required for most departments. What's your perspective? Are you focusing on teaching methods in the classroom, the language learning aspects for students, the psychological aspects, the economic aspects, the student's point of view, the professor's point of view? Choose your scope. Your focus. Is it going to be more of an empirically driven paper by evidence and data and research, or more based on principles? Principles, say, of what is right for the students, what's right for the professors. What kind of evidence, what kind of information and sources are you going to use? And you can develop kind of, okay, what are arguments for and against this? Maybe sketch out arguments for something and then against it. And I've got an example in the book. Well, there are arguments potentially for EMI policy, language immersion, and promoting students' English ability, English for academic research, for career, for globalization, school rankings, test scores, etc. Arguments against it. It's maybe not relevant to some departments, especially if you're studying, nursing or agriculture or certain fields. Different students have different English levels, and they're not ready for this kind of class that's taught in English. Better educated students, those who come from upper class families, are going to have an unfair advantage. Students' comprehension levels, that's going to impair their understanding of course contents and lectures and readings. Their performance, their exam performance, they're not ready for it. The emotional impacts on students, it doesn't necessarily help them with learning English. And the ranking metrics that maybe international agencies use to rank universities put a lot of weight on English courses, and maybe those metrics are just flawed or misused. And what about the students' attitudes? So there are different examples in the book, in this section, that you can look at, especially if you're interested in this topic. I'm going to stop here, and in the next video I'll talk a little bit about logical fallacies. So until then, enjoy. I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.